This evening, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, there are quite a few connections. I started out with a talk that would have run 2 hours, and I had to cut it down, so I cut out some whole chapters. And some of this material you will have heard of, but you won't have heard of it this way, and a lot of it you will never have heard. Local historians over the past 2 centuries have made quite a game of finding connections to our first president. Our own area has not been a heavy player in this game, but we do come to bat. At least as far back as 1875, Washington's 1753 trip to Fort Le Boeuf. Now I'm going to be saying a lot of French, Seneca and Delaware names. I've been really trying and practicing to say these, not that much good. That was locally well known. He didn't quite reach Chautauqua County in 1753, although 6 times he came west of the Appalachian Mountains. He never again approached nearer than roughly 100 air miles from Chautauqua County. He was in New York State for extended periods during the Revolution, and he started his presidency in New York City. But the farthest west he ever came in this state was in July 1783 when he came to Oneida Lake. There are a few times, however, when his attention should have, or actually was, directed to what is now Chautauqua County. All right, Chapter 1, Washington comes to Fort Le Boeuf. It was at the beginning of Washington's career, when he was 21, that he approached to 12 miles from the southwest corner of our county. Had he not subsequently become so famous, the incident would still be important to historians as one of the many and crucial steps irreversibly leading up to the French and Indian War. That war was one of the most important turning points in American history, and particularly so in our local history. England and France had been at war on and off for nearly 700 years. They had been contesting one another in North America for the last 140 of those years. Caught between the outliers of these advanced societies with populations in the tens of millions were the Indians, people with Stone Age technology and organization and total populations mostly smaller than a lot of present Chautauqua County villages. Things changed a lot for all 3 parties in the first half of the 18th century, but I don't have time to go into that here. To summarize, both European powers now saw the need to project power to the interior, and the Indians developed a much clearer idea of what they were up against. In 1753, the French took the initiative with a force of 2,200 men, some of them passing over Chautauqua Lake, and deployed at various forts along the Allegheny drainage. The disorganized English and colonial authorities dithered and dawdled, and finally, Virginia Governor Robert Dinwiddie took a deep breath and sent a strongly worded message. The French said 2,200 men. The English said a strongly worded message. All right. The messenger, George Washington, set out from Williamsburg October 31st, 1753. The following day at Fredericksburg, he picked up Jacob Van Braam. Van Braam was a Dutch immigrant with a limited command of English. Washington knew him as a Masonic brother and former fencing master. Now those facts are some of the ones I have the least definite documentation on. So anyhow, he was hired as French interpreter. On November 14th, they arrived at Willis Creek, which is now Cumberland, Maryland, where Washington engaged Christopher Gist as his guide. Gist was one of the most noted frontiersmen of the era. He was familiar with the Ohio Valley and familiar with the Indians, and he knew how to handle himself in the wilderness. We might also note that Gist's daughter, Nancy, about that time, was rather fond of young Washington, and he of her. Washington also, then and there, hired Barnaby Curran, an experienced Indian trader who had worked for Gist, and he hired John McGuire, another trader, William Jenkins, and Henry Stewart. Washington and his party now left the Potomac Valley and crossed over to the Youghiogheny and Monongahela, and then down to the present site of Pittsburgh, which was then uninhabited. And on the 22nd, they had stopped at the trading post of John Fraser from 1741 until earlier that year, 1753. Fraser and his had his trading post at Venango, which was the present-day Franklin, Pennsylvania. Several other traders also worked out of Venango. George Croghan, a Pennsylvania Irishman, had a storehouse at the present Irvin, less than 20 air miles, about 35 miles by water from Chautauqua Lake, as early as 1749. It seems almost certain that these English traders would have heard about the Chautauqua portage somewhere along the line from the Indians. On November 24th, Washington came to Logstown, near the present Economy in Ambridge, Pennsylvania, 18 miles downriver from the forks of the Ohio. This was one of the most important Indian towns in Pennsylvania, and it was as far as Captain William Trent had gone when he had set out as Governor Dinwiddie's first choice of messenger to the French. So Washington had got as far as the first try, and now everything more was a plus. The following day, Tangerison, or half-king, arrived in town. He was a Catawba by birth, captured young and raised as a Seneca. He was now serving as the Mingo chief and Iroquois representative. I should explain somewhere what the Mingos were, but it's a little complicated. They were like a sub-branch of the Iroquois in Pennsylvania. Washington asked him in private about the route and the country they had to travel. The interpreter, John Davison, was the only other man present. Tangerison would have known about the Chautauqua portage. Whether he told Washington about it or not, we can't know. If he did, it didn't make much of an impression. Tangerison did mention the fort at Presque Isle, Erie, where on September 3rd he had suffered an insulting reply to his demand that the French leave Indian land. Washington needed Indian guides and armed guards, and the Indians were eager to accompany him so they could find out what his secret mission was all about. Because of, not despite this, Washington was delayed at Logstown for days. The Indians, fraught with mixed incentives and mixed emotions, were scrambling slowly to collect wampum and chiefs necessary in their diplomatic formalities if they were to sever alliances with the French. Tangerison had little support behind him from his own Mingos, less still from the local Delawares and the Central Iroquois Council, which he served, and none at all from the local Shawnee. Washington was from a family interested in land development, and he was culturally a self-perceived Englishman. Even more than any of the French, he thought of the Indians as tedious obstacles in the long term, but valued allies in the short. While at Logstown, Washington encountered several other Indians who may have known the Chautauqua region. These included Shingas and Scoriaty, the Delaware chief, and an Oneida, and the first, or Scoriaty, was a Delaware chief, and or Shingas was, and Scoriaty was an Oneida Mingo official. His interpreter, Davidson, was widely traveled and knew many Indians who may have mentioned the lake in Portage, but Indians, for good reason, didn't often volunteer much geographical knowledge. Finally, Washington set out December 1st with his entourage, to which he had now added Davison, Tangarison, and 3 other Indians, any of whom may have known Chautauqua. These were just Kankakee, White Thunder, and a young Guyasuna. Just Kankakee was the chief charged with returning the wampum to the French, which was a diplomatic gesture of hostility. In the 1770s, Guyasuna, an uncle to Corn Planter, became the half-king or highest Iroquois authority in this area, and he certainly at that time was familiar with the Chautauqua court. He certainly was. In 1753, he was a young man brought along as a hunter and bodyguard. Washington may not even have learned his name. This party now set out northeasterly overland and cross-country to Venango, where they finally encountered a French outpost. They had traveled 70 miles in 5 days. There was, in 1753, no actual fort there, just John Fraser's trading post, which the French had recently seized and were now using. Venango was the scene of the famous meeting with Joncaire, although which Joncaire is not completely agreed by historians. Some think it was Daniel, probably it was Philippe Thomas, the older brother. But Joncaire was the one whose tongue was loosened by wine when he made the boast that it was their design to take possession of the Ohio, and by God, they would do it. Although the English could raise 2 men to the French 1, they were too slow and dilatory to stop the French. Washington exploited the relaxed atmosphere to gather specific and accurate information about routes, forts, and distances. Washington always had a keen appreciation of intelligence information. He was the first to use the name, Washington was the first one to use the name French Creek, perhaps because he did not know or could not spell the French name Rivière aux Boufs. Although Niagara Falls was an important fortification and supply point, he also failed to pick up that name, terming it instead the Falls of Lake Erie. It's not surprising he did not pick up the name Chautauqua, especially in view of the fact the French were not using the Chautauqua route that year. Joncaire, ironically, probably knew the Chautauqua portage better than any of the other French officers that Washington encountered. He had been over it several times since 1739, perhaps even before. Although as Indian superintendent, Joncaire was in charge of the Ohio Valley, he referred Washington to the highest ranking military officer on the Allegheny, upstream at Fort LeBoeuf. Washington and his party, again delayed by Indian diplomacy, set off December 6th, this time with a French escort, Pierre Pepin Laforce, and 3 soldiers. LaForce was a good man with the Indians. Through rain and snow and swamps, the party of 16 covered about 36 miles and arrived at sunset December 11th at Fort LeBoeuf, which was a real fort, a small one, but a real fort nonetheless. The commander at Fort LeBoeuf was the Gardeur de Saint-Pierre, who had arrived there December 3rd to take command following the death of Pierre-Paul Marin on October 29th. Saint-Pierre, at 52 years and 5 days age, impressed Washington as elderly. He was an experienced frontier officer. He had been through Chautauqua Lake with Baron de Longueuil in 1739, 10 years before Celeron, but his immediate previous assignment had been far western exploration, searching for the Pacific Ocean as far west as Manitoba. Now, I like to try to imagine this picture. Here's George Washington, 21 years old, and here is this Frenchman, 52 years old, and they meet, and the Frenchman says, welcome to His Catholic Majesty's domain. I'm sure you're tired from your long journey. Washington says, yes, indeed. I've walked 16 miles yesterday to get here. And the Frenchman says, I understand. I walked 1,000 miles last week to get here. And we don't think of, how much farther west history was taking place when we were still a backwater. Well, the next day, December 12th, Washington presented the letter from Dinwiddie, and Saint-Pierre had sent for La Gardeur de Repentigny, the commandant at Presque Isle, because he understood a little English among other reasons. He arrived at 2 o'clock. On the evening of the 14th, the French gave Washington their official reply, which was predictable, disappointing, and tentative. The final answer had to come from the top, Governor General Duquesne at Quebec. The French were very smooth in delay tactics with the Indians. They tried to detach the Indians from Washington, literally, as part of a larger strategy to detach them diplomatically from the English allegiance. Washington, inexperienced and against the odds, and against greater odds, tried valiantly, ingeniously, and partially successfully to thwart the French. The cost was 3 days' delay and considerable blunting of the force of Tangerison's protest to the French. Washington used the first day to spy out the number of canoes made and being made near the fort. He realized he had to report this alarming development back to Dinwiddie as soon as possible, and with equal urgency that he had to retain the attachment of the Indians. So after an extremely difficult and hazardous journey, Washington reached Williamsburg January 16th and presented the French reply to Governor Dinwiddie the same day, and the following day he turned in his journal prepared from his daily notes. Chapter 2, Maps associated with Washington's 1753 journal. Washington submitted a map with his journal. He was a professional surveyor, and his map included every detail of his journey. It also showed the portage to Presque Isle. The right-hand edge cut off sharply there, just short of the Chautauqua region. He cut the Allegheny off sharply short of the edge in a manner that suggests he knew nothing reliable about the further headwaters, and his map fails to show portions of French Creek and LeBoeuf Creeks above Lake LeBoeuf, streams that are toward and in Chautauqua County. And there you have the map that is an illustration of that. This map was not published in the 18th century. Dinwiddie sent several copies of Washington's journal by different ships because it's high priority intelligence. So if one or two ships sank, why it would still get to London. Extracts from the journal were printed in London Magazine for June of 1754. Accompanying these was a map of the western parts of the colony of Virginia. Next map, which showed Washington's path and much more of the surrounding area than Washington's own map. It also showed Bussaloons, which is at Irving, PA, and the Conewago named Conewagon, and an unnamed Chautauqua Lake. So here's a map published with George Washington's journal showing Chautauqua Lake. A full edition of Washington's journal was soon printed in London by the map maker and atlas publisher Thomas Jeffries. To it had been added a new map of the country as far as the Mississippi. This map much more closely resembled the map in the London Magazine than it did Washington's own map, but not enough for either to have been a copy of the other. Its treatment of our local region was the same, including the unnamed Chautauqua Lake. This map, not the one Washington actually drew, is the one most commonly associated with Washington's 1753 journey. By that I mean in publications. All right. Keep in mind that the best French maps have been accurately showing a named Chautauqua Lake since 1740. And as I said a minute ago, the French had been 1,000 miles farther inland. Meanwhile, back in Virginia, the following February, some Virginians built a little fort for the Ohio Company at the present location of Pittsburgh. The Ohio Company was an association of speculators, including friends and relatives of George Washington. The French came down the river, in large part over the Chautauqua portage, and shooed out the few Virginians April 16th. At the same time, Virginia was sending reinforcements toward the forts in the Ohio to support that little band that had built the fort. Washington was leading these troops, consisting of 145 soldiers, 18 officers, a drummer, 2 wagons, a surgeon, and a Swedish volunteer. Before he reached the spot, he learned that the French had taken the fort. He pressed on anyway, and on May 23rd, he skirmished with a small force sent out from the fort. So the first shots of the French and Indian War were fired that day by troops, some of whom had come down across Chautauqua Lake. And although the French had used the Chautauqua route little, if any, in 1753, they used it heavily in early 1754. And the first bullets ever fired at Washington in battle, many of them anyhow, had been carried over Chautauqua Lake. The French sent out a larger force, and Washington was forced to surrender, the famous Fort Necessity, on July 4th, of all things. The French obtained Washington's new journal and notes of this expedition, and they translated it and published them in 1755 for propaganda purposes. With the journal was a map, different from but similar to the Jeffries map of 1754. Again, it treated our area the same, including the unnamed Chautauqua Lake. All right, that's it right there. So far, we have 4 maps associated with Washington and the South Shore of Lake Erie in one way or another for 1753 and 1754. One the map he drew in 1753, of which 3 versions exist. 2, the map from the London Magazine. 3, the Jeffreys map, which 2 versions exist. And 4, the French translation of the captured map. The original English is lost. All right, chapter 3, the Walker-Washington map. By 1770, a lot of water had gone under the bridge. Washington had been with Braddock on his disastrous attempt to retake Fort Duquesne in 1755, and he'd been with Forbes in his successful effort in 1758. Washington had married, had acquired title to Mount Vernon, had become a member of the House of Burgesses, and had taken on other public offices. He had also, like most of his neighbors and members of his social class, acquired a considerable debt. With that on his mind, Washington had advised his neighbors of the wisdom of land speculation, and he also took his own advice seriously. Washington was entitled to land bounties because of his service in the French and Indian War. In 1770, the governor of Virginia had put up 200,000 acres for the veterans, partly on Washington's urging. Washington had also worked out a potentially profitable plan for himself and surveyor friend William Crawford on the side. So, on October 5th, 1770, George Washington set out on his 5th trip into the Ohio Valley, his first trip in civilian capacity, and the one which would bring him his lifetime second closest to our county. And he returned home December 1st. Before Washington set out on this journey, he copied a map which he designated Allegheny, copied from a map of Dr. Walker's laid before the Assembly. Next map. There it is. This was a map Dr. Thomas Walker presented to the House of Burgesses on December 13th, 1769. Walker was a skilled physician, but he was also an explorer, a land speculator, and political figure from Albemarle County, Virginia. He was the earliest explorer of Kentucky who kept a good record of his journey. He worked for the Loyal Land Company, the chief rival of the Ohio Company, to which George Washington had connections. So his map covered a much larger territory than his actual Kentucky explorations. Obviously, he borrowed from available published maps. His map included all of Lake Erie and the Chautauqua region. It is quite crude and it shows no Chautauqua Lake, no names in this area, not even where Washington had personally gone in 1753. But it does show this region, and George Washington drew it, and it includes the Conowingo. And as I say, Washington had either drawn or copied it, but it really does reinforce the idea that Washington remained quite uninterested in our area up to this time. We're at chapter 5, the Broadhead Expedition. The Sullivan-Clinton campaign against the Iroquois homeland was one of the most exhaustively planned and important of Washington's few offensive campaigns in the war. Nevertheless, I'm hitting it lightly here because I cover it at length in my talk about Chautauqua County's connections to the Revolutionary War. Initially, a third force under Colonel Daniel Broadhead at Pittsburgh was supposed to come up the Allegheny and join forces with Sullivan and Clinton, and then go on west and take Fort Niagara. Washington made a determined effort to learn all he could about the routes the armies would have to take, including the route from Pittsburgh to Niagara, but he wasn't actually able to find out much. So he canceled Brodhead's part of the campaign. But Brodhead went ahead anyhow and came up as far as what is now the state line. Anyhow, in the process, Washington found a few informants who drew rough maps. The only one that seems to have survived, there it is, shows little more than the mouths of the unnamed Conewango and named French Creek. And there's French Creek and the Conewango. All right, but Washington's interest was now turned toward this general region. We can safely assume he carefully examined most of the better maps of the time, including those of Lewis Evans, 1755, plus the updated Thomas Pownall version of 1776. Let's have that next. And there is the Pownall map, and Edgar was working on the blow-up of the Chautauqua region, but anyhow, there is Chautauqua Lake in 1776, although we can be pretty sure Washington looked at that map, but we don't have any actual evidence of that. All right, for reference, he looked at these for reference, and here's the well-known Pownall map. And he also would have looked at the map of Dr. John Mitchell from 1755, all of which showed a tiny named Chautauqua Lake, named. Mitchell had complete access to all the official sources when he drew his map, and these certainly would have included copies of many French maps. And Evans worked more directly from field sources and informants. He admitted limited knowledge or outright guesswork for the Allegheny headwaters, and what he did know of that river was from numerous traders and an otherwise unknown, very intelligent Indian called the Eagle. Despite Delaware friends, white deserters from Fort Niagara, and other stray travelers, surprisingly little knowledge about the region above the state line or the location of the later corn planter grant was forthcoming, or at least surprisingly little was located and considered by Washington. Okay, chapter 6? George Washington's interest in the transportation route. Now we're after the war. George Washington's properties, both Mount Vernon and his western land investments, had been neglected during the war, Revolutionary War. As part of his efforts to make corrections, he took a trip west in the fall of 1784. On October 4th, the day he returned from his western trip, he sat down and tabulated the distances and features of numerous possible connecting routes between the Atlantic and Mississippi drainages. He included calculations for a route from Detroit to Philadelphia via Erie or Presque Isle and French Creek, based on his own experience in 1753. He also considered a route around Niagara Falls and then from Lake Ontario through Oneida Lake to the Mohawk River. Washington did not calculate the Chautauqua route that day. 1788, 4 years later, was an extremely busy year for Washington. For one thing, it was the year the Constitution was up for ratification. But throughout that year, Washington was corresponding with General William Irvine, who had been the last officer to command at Pittsburgh in and immediately after the war. Irvine, of course, was aware of Chautauqua Lake, both from information he had gained at the fort and from explorations he had personally conducted in 1785. He had come up to the Conewango from Warren, and is now where Warren is. He'd come up a short way, but he had found out what he could about Chautauqua Lake from two companions. One was Elijah Matthews, who had grown up as a captive at the location of Meadville, and from an Indian, and we don't know for sure if that Indian was Captain Crow, who was Cornplanter's son-in-law, or Allface, who was the village chief at Kindtone. Washington had apparently forgotten his earlier calculations of potential transportation routes through the mountains and about his late in the war correspondence with Irvin about routes for another possible attack on Pittsburgh, or on Niagara from Pittsburgh. 6.5 years later, and 2 years after his journey of exploration, Irvin was finishing a 2-year term as congressman from the Cumberland, Pennsylvania district. Washington wrote to him on January 10th of that busy year, 1788, with questions about the same water divides and portages he had considered on the day he returned from his western trip in 1784. He seems to have forgotten what Irvin had written in 1782 about the route above Conewango. Now, Obed Edson in Young's History prints this exchange on pages 54 to 60, as alluded to above. Now, it was Obed Edson, not Andrew Young or Eliel T. Foote, who wrote the first chapter in Young's History. Most people don't realize that. Well, anyhow, that's the 1875 history. In it, Irvin tells Washington of the Chautauqua and Conewango portages by name and recommends the Chautauqua route. He refers to Hutchins' map, and go back one. That's Hutchins' map. I'm afraid that's a little blurry version I've got there. He refers to Hutchins' map, which, like several others, shows JADAQUE, calls that very poor, which is true. He was, on October 6th, Irvin sent Washington a map made or copied from the men in the State Line Survey, which of course, State Line Survey was 1787. And I termed that this is east and west. This is a state line. And this is before the Erie Triangle was cut off. And you see that the Pennsylvania line at that time went out and had about 2 miles of shoreline on Lake Erie. All right. He sent that map to Washington, made by or copied by men of the State Line Survey. Edson, Obed Edson, the great historian, mistakenly reports that this map shows Lake Chautaugh. Actually, it makes the narrows too long and puts Chautauqua in the upper lake and Qua in the lower lake. You can see that yourself. It's Chautauqua Lake. That's the State Line Survey, 1787. All right. In his last reply on October 31st, Washington even repeats the name Chautauqua, to the next slide, which he spells Chautaughque. And there it is. And that was actually a common spelling at that time, and that was the spelling for the first post office in Chautauqua County at Westfield. But in any event, that was the most common spelling, okay, at that time. So, there is Chautauqua Lake in George Washington's handwriting. Chapter 7, The Fatal Route. In October 1790, Cornplanter and 5 other Seneca Indians, Halftown Big Tree, James Hutchins, Seneca Billy, and John Decker, came to Philadelphia with their translator, Joseph Nicholson, on an official mission to the Pennsylvania government to make numerous formal complaints. All of them had Chautauqua connections. Cornplanter had hunted the shores of the lake with his two sons summer after summer in the 1780s. Halftown was regional chief before Cornplanter moved in. Later, he was chief of the tiny village of Kyneton. John Decker was a veteran of the Hannistown raid, which passed over Chautauqua Lake in July of 1782. And he was born near Franklin, Pennsylvania, and was probably Cornplanter's cousin. He spoke some English. Nicholson was a captive who had lived with the Senecas most of his life. He had piloted Broadhead up the Allegheny in 1779 and was wounded in the skirmish below Warren. He already knew Washington. Nicholson was Washington's guide down the Ohio in 1770. He spoke 7 languages. At this time, the seat of the federal government, and George Washington with it, moved from New York to Philadelphia. So the Senecas took the opportunity to bring their grievances to the president. On December 1st, 1790, Cornplanter delivered his rehearsed and memorized 2,800-word speech to George Washington, about half as long as my speech tonight. It is signed by Cornplanter, Halftown, and Bigtree, and written in the first person plural. This speech was largely about the harsh terms imposed at treaties, including Second Treaty of Fort Stanwix, the Treaty of Fort Harmar, also about the Livingston 999-year leases, which is an interesting, complex story, and the Phelps and Gorham sale. Cornplanter essentially appealed to Washington's honor and mercy. He also indicated the Indians were resigned to adopting white farming methods and needed help. Early in the second half of the speech, after most of the specifics were taken care of, Cornplanter brought up the fatal root. And I'm assuming that all of you know one of the supposed meanings of Chautauqua, well, a couple of them have to do with the fatal root. This is a quote from Cornplanter. "Father, you have said we are in your hand, and by closing it, you would crush us to nothing. Are you determined to crush us? If so, tell us so, that those of our nation who have become your children and have determined to die so, may know what to do. In this case, one chief has said he would ask you to put him out of his pain. Another, who will not think of dying by the hand of his father or his brother, has said he will retire to the Chautauqua, eat the fatal root, and sleep with his fathers in peace." That's the quote from Cornplanter. Obed Edson thought the fatal root was mayapple. However, we can be confident that it was actually wild parsnip, Circuita maculata, and this grows in wet places and was commonly employed for suicide by the Iroquois, particularly the women, and probably is so to this day. And its effects are much more unpleasant than the legend implies. In later exchanges with Washington in this same series of back and forth talks, Cornplanter addressed an agreement to guarantee both Indians and whites free passage in Chautauqua Lake if the new boundary put the lake in the state of Pennsylvania. We're talking now about the western boundary, not the south boundary, and that hadn't been drawn yet. The Indians were also guaranteed half the fish in the lake. So George Washington heard about Chautauqua a couple of times from Cornplanter. All right, chapter 8. George Washington did not sleep here. If you live on the western edge of Chautauqua County, no doubt you have heard the assertion that George Washington visited Finley Lake or even Chautauqua Lake in 1753. I can trace the story back to a local historian named Carlson Robertson. He was active in the Boy Scouts and the County Historical Society in the 1930s, and he was town historian for Mina in the 1940s. He wrote a manuscript, probably in 1936, and a copy of which is in the Fenton Historical Society Library, and another one in the Chautauqua County Historical Society Archives. And I quote, "It seems that when Washington was on his famous mission to the French, he originally had orders to go to Fort Niagara, which was the real headquarters of the French army. He visited Fort Le Boeuf, as everyone knows, then set out for Niagara, crossing the northern edge of our town en route. But when he neared the upper end of Chautauqua Lake, the inclement weather and the hostility of the Indians convinced him that it was both superfluous and foolhardy to continue further. He turned back. Night found him and his one companion, probably Christopher Gist, at the shore of a small woodland lake with an island in the middle. He built a crude raft in the storm and managed to reach the island, where they found refuge from the Indians and the weather in a heavy thicket of hemlocks. There they stayed for 3 days, then walked ashore on the ice which had formed during their visit. The place where they are supposed to have built the raft is at the point which extends into the lake towards the Big Island." Now, this was repeated by Judge Lee L. Ottaway in talks for the County Historical Society in 1940 and 1956, and in the Post-Journal in 1974 and 2018. To be fair, other than Robertson, all the accounts did describe the story as a legend the 2018 Post-Journal accepted. There is a historical marker on the island to this day put up by the property owner. Am I correct? I could not find a picture.
I'll take over, Glenn.
Could not find a picture.
I have a picture,
I'm not sure of the actual wording, and it is the source of some local discord. In my longer paper, I tell the incident that seems to have inspired this story. The real island was in the Allegheny River, now within the city of Pittsburgh, probably the Lawrenceville neighborhood. Washington never had any authority, much less orders, to take his case beyond the frontier forts, and he never mentions Niagara in his report, and the French headquarters was in Quebec, not Niagara. All right, next chapter, Washington and the Kinzua Dam. I'm running out of time, so I will very briefly mention the 1794 Canandaigua Treaty that is at issue in the Kinzua Dam controversy. That's the treaty mentioned on the bumper stickers. You have an image of the treaty? All right, this is pretty hard to read. This is out of Arthur Parker's History of the Senators. Cornplanter and George Washington did not ever really get together. They signed the treaty at different times and different places. Johnny Cash did not write the song "As Long as the Grass Shall Grow." He had a hit with it in 1964, but Peter Lafarge, can we have the next slide? No there? All right, Peter Lafarge recorded it in 1962 for Folkways Records. And the phrase, "as long as the grass shall grow," does not appear in the treaty or any Indian treaty that I've ever read, and I've read quite a few, but it does appear in a lot of the negotiations for Indian treaties. I've traced it back as far as 1682 to the mouth of William Penn. Whether he coined it or got it from an uncredited Delaware Indian, I do not know. A Dutch version of it does occur in a treaty of 1613, but that whole treaty is a fake. So, in closing, I'm going to skip all the Revolutionary War veterans who saw or met Washington in the war or later, all the mementos, all the streets, boats, and schools in the county named for George Washington. And I'll end with a quote from the diary of Halliday Jackson, one of the Quakers from the mission on the reservation just 10 miles from Chautauqua County. It is geographically the closest record we have of a response to the news of Washington's death. Now, the new year being come, in the first month on the last day of the month, I received letters from my kinspeople in the land of my nativity, and from the great city, and there was many sayings written therein. And it was made known unto me that George, who in the days of old was chief ruler of the people of the provinces, was dead, and his death was lamented sore in the great city and throughout all the cities of the people of the provinces, because his fame was great and his worthy acts was known among the nations. And the great Sanhedrin ceased from their counseling and put on their mourning apparel, and all the rulers and counselors in the great city, and those that were in public office under the great Sanhedrin, did cease to execute judgment in those days, and their countenance was sad, and the voice of mourning was heard in the streets, because the champion of the people of the provinces was dead. Indeed, questions are solicited now.
You mentioned the village of Pinetone, and I never was clear, maybe it's written down, it's never came across it. Was that abandoned, or was it destroyed in Broadstreet's efforts during the war? I mean, Broadhead.
No. Broadhead probably did not come to Pinetone, almost certainly did not. Pinetone was really loved by the Indians, both the contact period and way back, going into thousands of years. And they tried to negotiate, Farmer's Brother in particular, tried to negotiate with Joseph Ellicott to cut out an extra reservation for them there. And Ellicott said that'd be the most horrible headache. And he managed to get them to take a little more on the Allegheny Reservation, which is that little thumb, that Cold Spring. And I am not absolutely certain, but it looks to me like some of the families stayed there, or at least planted gardens or crops there, even after the Treaty of Big Tree, as late as maybe 1808, when the white settlers started to come. Paul.
So Washington was only a young man, 21 years old, you say, in 1753?
That's correct.
So what was the purpose, and who ordered, or who gave the orders for him to do this sort of trip to the French? Was he a military man? I mean,
Yes, he was in the Virginia militia.
Oh, militia, okay. And so the orders would have come from Dinwiddie through the King of England?
The crown wanted somebody to send this strongly worded message, and so did all the colonies, but they didn't want to do anything about it. New York should have done something. It diddle-daddled. Pennsylvania was even worse because it was ruled by, Quakers. So they did nothing and just sat on their thumbs, and Dinwiddie decided that somebody had to do something. Of course, the Pittsburgh area there at that time was in dispute between Pennsylvania and Virginia as to which colony that would fall in. So Dinwiddie had, reasonable jurisdiction there.
So was Washington some sort of had some sort of notoriety, had some sort of personality and expertise to have been chosen for this?
Well, he was a professional surveyor,
Yeah.
and his family was interested in land in that area, and he was from a prominent family.
Right.
Yeah.
He was a colonel, right? He had rank.
I'm not even positive about that, but it sounds right.
At that point, he was a lieutenant when he was at Fort LaBeouf.
Yeah. Was that a question?
No, it was a statement.
Okay.
I'm a representative of Finley Lake Historical Society, and I'm the town historian right now. And so I did want to take a minute to just dispel the legend fact thing that George Washington was on our big island that now has a building on it. It's in the middle, still in the middle of the lake. But many people have owned it, and it's kind of has a mystique, so I don't know if that kind of brought the legend about. But also, as a historical society, you know, we are supposed to be factual, not legend, fairy tale thing. So we decided to invite who but Norman Carlson to a public meeting. And he told us exactly what he just told all of you, that, you know, no way. But also, because of that, we have been kind of researching Washington in our area, and that Fort LaBeouf does have a little museum. I don't know if it's still active, but it was for years. And right across the street is, I think, about a 100-year-old statue of George Washington. And I've heard that it's the only statue, like granite statue, with a Virginia militia uniform in the country. But that could just be those historians telling me that's in Waterford.
Hey Norm, right here is the plaque on the island that says George Washington slept here. Truth or
Oh, send that to me.
right here.
I know, but that was the owners, and that guy has so much property, and his wife had a hard time finding a birthday gift for him. So what did she do? Get a historic marker and place it on it. And that's the truth.
So unless you're circumnavigating the island, you'll never see it. But there it is. It's on the island.
Well, before I got into
I think it starts with fact or legend.
It does. It says George Washington slept here. Truth or legend. Truth or legend.
Yeah.
So it does give it a little disclaimer.
Corn Planter was given 3 parcels. Now, these were not reservations. This was private property. And one of them was the well-known Corn Planter Grant, which at the time, someone's time was called Planter's Field, just 3 miles south of the state line. Another one was the parcel that Gail was talking about, and there was a third. One of them was called the Gift. They all had names. Anyhow, Corn Planter lost those 2 other than the Corn Planter Grant, but they were unique in that they were private property registered to Corn Planter himself, and that resulted in some interesting situations down a couple of generations along about 1871. The full story has been printed in the Warren County Historical Society Stepping Stones, and that issue is somewhere on the shelf over in the other building. And I think it's also in one of the volumes of the Genesee Country. It's just for some reason that sticks in my memory. That's also on the shelf over there. And another thing while I'm on the subject, and Ken Burns made this mistake. Almost everybody makes this mistake. The Broadhead campaign and the burning of the villages up the Allegheny, particularly the location that was later called Burnt House, where Corn Planter moved in. And that's where Corn Planter got his Indian name of Town Destroyer. Well, he had that name years before the Revolutionary War. We have documents with him signing his name to Indians that way. He got it from his grandfather, and we don't know where he got it.
You said Corn Planter, you meant Washington.
Washington, did I say Corn Planter? Washington, George Washington.
Yeah, was the town.
Sorry, I don't want to confuse people. It's easy enough to do.
But Ken Burns was wrong.
Yeah, you got that wrong. A lot of people do. He will be at Chautauqua, you all realize that. the day following our History Expo. All together now, what date? August 2nd.
Mayville High School.
That's right. All right, I really like answering questions. I like you to answer it, or to ask them. I know that it means you